People should be in for a shock once we get into Season 2 of House of the Dragon. Honestly, I think viewers unfamiliar with the source material will be downright horrified, and I'll loop back around to that in just a second. This is going to be a Q&A where I take your questions and answer them here in a video format. So to be included in the next Q&A video, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you'll be notified of future community posts and videos so that you can have your questions answered in the future. So the first question comes from Marisi. I hope I'm pronouncing that as correctly as possible. I don't think that I am, so I do apologize. But their question is, what are your general and overall expectations for House of the Dragon Season 2? How do you think they should portray the Blood and Cheese plotline? So I am cautiously optimistic about Season 2. The first season had some tremendously good episodes, but at times I feel like the showrunners opted to end a couple of the episodes with more spectacle to garner more shock and awe from your more casual viewers. The two examples are the ending of episode 5 and then, of course, the ending of episode 9. I would have liked to see them trust that the drama could carry the impact of each episode, and I was a little put off by the death of Joffrey Lonmouth in episode 5 because whatever fallout from him being brutally beaten to death was never actually explored. So knowing that they needed to take a significant time jump by episode 6 made the episode 5 ending seem a bit absurd or even unnecessary. I thought the impact of Alicent arriving in her infamous green dress, with the commentary by Lara Strong signaling the Hightowers calling their bannermen to war, that was on par with the cleverness that Game of Thrones fans really enjoyed in the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. So I do love how Ryan Condal and company approached the subtlety and drama in the first season, and I do expect more of that. But I do believe they'll continue to lean into the spectacle to cap each episode, which I'm not a huge fan of, but critics really didn't seem to go after them all that much, and general audiences unfamiliar with the source material, they really didn't seem to mind that much either. So it may just be my own personal preference on how they handle the individual episodes or the finality of an episode. With the Blood and Cheese plotline, I just hope that they do have the guts to actually do just that and kind of even go over the top with it a little bit and really hit the audience hard, because that's a very dramatic moment in the books. And there's actually, the way Fire and Blood is written, it's more of a historical text for the history of Westeros, so it doesn't linger a whole lot. But what I think that they're going to do is they'll probably execute that moment pretty early on in season 2. I actually liked how they structured the death of Luke to end the first season, but I think Blood and Cheese will occur early in season 2. There shouldn't be much as far as time jumps anymore. I think we'll find this season maybe even more refreshing because there are not those time jumps, similar to how audiences experienced A Storm of Swords in Game of Thrones season 4, where the Purple Wedding occurred after the midpoint in A Storm of Swords, or at the very beginning, episode 2 of Game of Thrones. We as an audience will experience the fallout in the following episodes, and that could make everything a lot more interesting, and it'll give it a little bit more juice to the season overall, starting it off that way. At least this is what I'm hoping for. And I don't see how they can wait any longer than episode 2 for Blood and Cheese, especially with season 2 being only 8 episodes as far as execution of the plot. I do expect this to be almost identical to the book, but I do hope that they leave room for debate on the identity of Cheese and don't just tell us directly that his identity is nobody or that he's actually Lara Strong or something like that. I don't want the conspiracy theories to be resolved too soon. It's kind of like the, who is the father of Rhaenyra's children, where that's hinted at heavily in the book, but it still remains a mystery in the book. They just flat out answer that for us in House of the Dragon. And, it works, but I also like the mystery in the book. So the next question comes from literally Rick Grimes. So I guess a little bit of a Walking Dead fan there. Who are your top 3 favorite characters in the Game of Thrones universe and why? Me personally, it's 1, Jaime, 2, Tyrion, 3, Jon. So I kind of have an interesting way of viewing my favorite characters. So Jon is kind of a mainstream answer, but he is the character that I always connected to the most at first. However, we'll see if things go differently in Winds of Winter if it is ever written or published. But in the show, John stopped being my favorite character almost immediately after season 4. Again, this is kind of hard to answer just because it does seem to change from time to time with different readings, and the shows kind of influence it a little bit, not too much, but they offer maybe a little bit of a different context to look at some of these characters. But in the books, my favorite chapters are Jamie, just because I love the way that inner conflict is exposed to the reader when we finally get his point of view, and I mostly enjoy his character in the show. I am currently trying to complete a whole video series on his character, so if that tells you anything, maybe I've made it a little bit obvious who has become one of my more favorite characters. Now, I'll actually take this a step further. If you can't tell, I'm actually kind of a Lannister loyalist as far as the family that I find the most fascinating. That's the house that I look to for maybe a little bit more intrigue, where I kind of lose interest in the Starks. Not that one's better or the other. Like, I'm not rooting for the Lannisters. I just enjoy reading their chapters more. But it all starts with Tywin and how he's kind of created daddy issues for all three, Cersei, Jaime, and Tyrion. And you can kind of see where all of their inner conflicts can, in a way, go back to Tywin in some form or shape or fashion. As far as creating a top 3, it would be Jon in the books, Jaime, and to kind of throw a curveball, I have to say, I really enjoy Sansa's chapters in Clash of Kings and in A Storm of Swords, just because I really loved how well George R. R. Martin wrote kind of her hopelessness and naivety, and just really being kind of young and immature and not really seeing the world for the way that it is until kind of it's too late. And then it gets into like hopeless desperation to escape King's Landing. Her confusion about thinking she'd be married to Loras Tyrell, only to find out that the proposal was never with Loras, it was for his brother Willis, who's actually the heir to Highgarden, which makes for a better situation for her. But she doesn't know that. She doesn't think about that. Watching her go from disappointment to hopeful, even though in her view, Willis was not as a good marriage, right, as Loras. A Clash of Kings really painted the image of how trapped Sansa is. And in A Storm of Swords was the epitome of her getting her hopes up. And Ser Dantos in the background, making her feel as if she was maybe even waiting in vain, because it just got stretched out and dragged on so long from the time that he initially told her that he's going to try to get her out of King's Landing. So it really makes me as a reader sit there with her agony and despair, and I just feel like it draws a lot of empathy for her character, and I don't hear many other readers talk about this, but when I first read Sansa's chapters, I remember feeling desperate myself, and as if I really understood what it was like to be in her shoes, because her desires were so straightforward and innocent and immature, because they're just rooted in such youthful desperation that anyone who's been incarcerated, I imagine, would relate to how she found pleasures in the slightest things, as one may experience in their own personal hell or imprisonment. So I hope I answered your question. To keep it simple, my 3 favorite characters to read are Jon, Jaime, and Sansa. Kind of a wild card for that third one. I know that doesn't sound like very popular, but it's just what I prefer to read. Specifically, Sansa in A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords. If I had to choose a favorite show character, I don't know. I don't have a favorite show character, so I love Pedro Pascal. So Oberyn, I mean, why not? And next, this next question comes from a friend of the channel. I recommend you guys check him out too and subscribe to his channel. You never know, we just might get a collaboration together here in the near future. So this question is from Voice of Old Town. What are some things that future live action shows set in Westeros should avoid? Okay, so there's a common issue, and I spoke about this a bit in my first question, but I really do not like that House of the Dragon felt the need to end certain episodes with a bang, when the impact of the drama can be just as compelling at times. When you think of the best episodes from Game of Thrones or even House of the Dragon, sometimes it almost seems like they undercut themselves on what would otherwise be just as good of episodes, if not great episodes as well. So if you look at episode 8 of House of the Dragon, episode 9 was becoming a very good episode, but I hate what happened there at the end with Rhaenys. I didn't think that was necessary. I don't know how she was going to escape there, but it just called out like this spectacle that really wasn't needed. And I think audiences would have enjoyed that episode just as much if that were not to have happened. And then instead, now we've got these weird debates about whether she should have killed all the Greens right then and there, which, sure, of course she should have. But, we're having debates that are based on things that are show only and they don't follow the main narrative from the books. And I just really didn't like that. Not that I'm being a book purist. I don't think that's necessary. I want them to add things. I want them to change things and better contextualize things. But I just wasn't a fan of that. It's kind of like when they show Viserion being pulled out of the water with those gigantic chains by the White Walkers back in season 7. What was the actual point to doing that? Other than spoiling the impact of the Night King using Viserion to bring down the wall at the end of season 7. I mean, it kind of takes away from the impact of that a little bit. Imagine if you didn't know what happened to Viserion and Viserion in your mind was just dead. And we could have all speculated and suspected that Viserion would have been brought back as and risen up as a dragon white, something like that. But they kind of took that conversation away and just immediately let us know what was going to happen there. Fortunately, I think like Dunk and Egg will have a much more grounded element to it compared to many of the other stories set in Westeros. So the insistence of spectacle and CGI riddled episodes really should be limited. I'm sure they'll kind of spruce it up with maybe more or additional action than what's actually there in the novellas. Another thing is sticking to the spirit of the original characters, even if George isn't there to consult with. That's something I think is important. I hate how simple and casual the dialogue became once the source material was no longer used in Game of Thrones. I love that House of the Dragon has been able to capture the voices of Westeros in a way that actually reflects the way George wrote these characters and how he would write their dialogue. And considering Fire and Blood doesn't actually do much in terms of dialogue or really character development when compared to A Song of Ice and Fire's main series, I feel like House of the Dragon did a fantastic job at demonstrating a believable voice for these characters that felt like they lived in the same Westeros Game of Thrones fans experienced in those earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. Now, one thing that's so important moving forward, I think, is maintaining a consistent pace. I've said this before, but time jumps are my biggest issue with how they structured House of the Dragon's first season. But the individual episodes all moved at a consistent pace and nothing seemed to be jarring there. So the individual episode pace I thought was great. They needed the time jumps for the overall season, so I understand that. Still doesn't make me like it, but I also don't have a better idea of how they would have handled, those gaps in time and stuff without the jumps. So that is just what it is. Game of Thrones did this very well, though, in the earlier seasons where in-world travel felt very believable, and it allowed the audience to feel kind of the scope of Westeros and, of course, Essos as well for the Daenerys plot. And they did it really, pretty simply. You could travel, across the continent in one episode, but because they would have their little individual stops. So when they stopped and they discussed the parentage of Jon's bastard, Ned and Robert, in season 1. And then they eventually arrive at the Trident. So, they handled travel pretty well there. I don't think that was done terribly, and it really opened it up. And it was a small way to handle that, just having them stop along their ways of travel. Even if it's just to stop, even if it's to jump back in while they're actually on horseback or whatever it is they're doing, just for a conversation, just for a dialogue scene. I think that can go a long way. I think it did go a long way for those earlier seasons of Game of Thrones, and I'd like to see that done. And I think that absolutely will be done with Dunk and Egg. Look, guys, that's all for now. Guys, if you want your questions answered in video format, make sure you do subscribe to the channel so that you do see the community posts where I will prompt you to write your questions. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving it a like and click on the screen now for another video that you might enjoy.